Yes, we are.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to welcome all of you to our medical school's 2021 Hispanic Heritage Month celebration. Tomorrow marks the last day of this important month-long celebration, which this year is focusing on Hispanic heritage and hope. Beginning on September 15th, people from all across our country in groups large and small, in gatherings virtual and in person, have come together to reflect on and recognize the Latinx community's rich, diverse, vibrant, foundational, and enduring contributions to our nation, to our shared values, traditions, and culture, and to our success, past, present, and future. As we reflect on and recognize the tremendous contributions of this country's thriving population of Hispanic Americans, so too we must renew and affirm our institutional commitment to fostering, preserving, and celebrating a brighter and better future, one in which core values like diversity, equity, inclusion, civility, mutual understanding, and shared humanity pervade and inform all of our interactions, both as individuals and as part of our larger academic community. As we conclude the 2021 National Hispanic Heritage Month, it's fitting that we have an opportunity to hear and learn from a fellow higher education leader who espouses and exemplifies these very values as president of Quinsigamond Community College. While President Luis Predraja will be formally introduced shortly, I just want to take a moment to thank him for joining our procedures today and for participating with us. We're very grateful, President Predraja, for your willingness to serve as the keynote speaker today, and we look forward to listening to your remarks. I can tell you that it's been a particularly rewarding experience for me to interact with the president in a group of Worcester area college presidents, particularly over the course of the last year. And I can tell my colleagues here at the medical school that the president has been constantly concerned about the very special population that are educated at our community colleges, and has been a very forceful advocate for their needs, their concerns. And it's been particularly rewarding for me to participate with him. And Luis, I want you to know how much I respect your leadership in our group, and how much I appreciate what a important and forceful advocate you are for your students, faculty, and staff. Before I turn the meeting over, I want to especially acknowledge and convey my gratitude to our faculty, staff, residents, postdocs, and students who share a Hispanic heritage. I want to thank you for all that you do to make our medical school such a successful and dynamic institution. And lastly, I want to thank Vice Chancellor Marlena Duncan and the DIO team for organizing and supporting culturally enriching events like this one, and most importantly, for supporting and advancing a most welcoming, inclusive, and diverse environment here at our medical school. While there's much more that can and must be done throughout the medical school enterprise, we feel fortunate to have colleagues like Vice Chancellor Duncan as sincere and steadfast partners and compelling champions for diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's wonderful to be all together today, talking about these important issues, welcoming a dear colleague, and celebrating with all of you this important Hispanic Heritage Month. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with you.
Thank you, Chancellor Collins, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really, truly a pleasure for me to be able to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Luis Predraja. He is a theologian, philosopher, author, scholar, and educator. And as president of Quinsigamond Community College, Dr. Predraja provides leadership to the college community while working to enhance the college's mission to address the higher education needs and economic development of the Worcester community. He is a passionate advocate for increased access to higher education for all people, especially those who have been underserved historically by the American higher education system. Throughout his career, Dr. Predraja has focused on Latinx perspectives and has published many books and articles exploring how understanding language and culture promote intercultural dialogue and tolerance. This afternoon, he is bringing to us an important message around the other pandemic, systemic racism in the Latinx community. We welcome you, Dr. Predraja, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you, Chancellor Collins, and everyone at UMass Medical School for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here. And often I speak about the multiple pandemics that we're experiencing. We're very aware, of course, of the COVID and the pandemic and how it's devastated the communities, particularly Latino and Black communities in this country, and the poor have been significantly affected. And at the same time, to expose another type of pandemic, which is systemic racism. And it's the one that has been with us far longer. And although we're celebrating Hispanic heritage and talking about hope in the future, we cannot look at the future while recognizing the past and recognizing the history, the brokenness of our countries and the fractures that have developed in the hateful discourse and divisions that we have seen more graphically portrayed during the pandemic with the killings of Black and Brown individuals, as well as the effect of the pandemic. That's why for me it's important to contextualize this and speak of it in terms of this other pandemic that affects us all, and that also affects the Latino community significantly. And part of what I want to share is a little bit of the context. To understand the Latino culture, you have to understand who we are. And the first piece that I would like to share with you is a little bit about who I am and why I feel the need to be an advocate for Latinos and other minoritized community. I'm Cuban American, and I was born in Cuba. I spent the first 6 years of my life there. And since I'm speaking to a medical school, I wanted to highlight that some of my earliest memories as a child were actually of being in the hospital. I was very sickly. I would get dehydrated from throwing up, and I would often have to be rushed to the hospital. And on one of those occasions, I was in an accident, and on the way to the hospital, I was ejected from the car and spent days there. So being in medical facilities are one of the things that have shaped me as a child. But it also highlighted some of the disparities and the challenges of people in third and second world and minoritized parts of the world, which is actually the largest part of our globe experience without access to potable water, with limited access to healthcare. I was being rushed to a hospital in a taxi because there's no ambulance service. They would tie a white handkerchief to the car and go honking. Hence why the accident occurred. And I think it's important to understand that for many Latinos, we face challenges even before we get to this country, in our own countries, and then they continue here. Access to healthcare is very limited. Access to education is also limited. Sometimes language barriers, sometimes the schools that are available where we live do not provide ESL or other services. I remember coming home and crying because I couldn't understand my teachers when I first came to this country. And although I was smart and I came from a more advanced level of education, I struggled my first few months in school because of the language barrier. And as an immigrant coming into this country, you look at it with hope. I always saw of America as this mythical place across the water that we're sending people to the moon. And from that generation, when the first moonshots were happening, and I kind of idealized it as a child. And then arriving here and feeling the sense of belonging but not belonging, being caught in the middle, shifted my perspective. I realized that there were wonderful things about this country, but there are also a lot of challenges. And in the early 70s, barely out of the challenges of the 60s and civil rights movement, we were experiencing some of those things still. We didn't have a lot of money. I grew up in inner city Miami, and my parents will always tell me, study hard, because they can take away everything, but they can't take your education. After we left everything behind in Cuba, that really resonated with me. It also helped shape who I was. This belief that education can transform your life. And as first generation college student, I had my doubts going into college. Did I belong there? I was ridiculed by some people in my dorm because of my name. They made fun of it. They could not pronounce Predraja. I was called pajama, perchisis, and all kinds of things. And people don't realize that, that wears at you. There's a sense of your identity that starts with your name. And the fact that one could not pronounce it was not a problem for me, but the fact that they would make up stuff to make fun of it really affected me, because it hit on my identity. And I struggled fitting in, but I made it through. Coming out of that low income inner city community, I would never imagine that one day I'll be a president of a college or speaking at UMass Medical School on Latino heritage. My future had limited options. And even during the course of my education, while I was in graduate school, I had a call one Friday afternoon that my father had died of a sudden heart attack at age 55. And part of that was because limited access to healthcare. When I was going into grad school and he was helping me move, he was having chest pains, but he didn't want to see a doctor. He didn't want to go to the hospital and get checked out because he couldn't afford to take time off. And he couldn't afford the insurance, the costs. And socioeconomic and racial issues affect not only who we are, and doesn't only kill us when somebody brutalizes us in an act of violence. It also kills us slowly through lack of access to healthcare, through lack of access to quality education, and to resources. And I think it's important to recognize that that is as significant of a pandemic as other issues, and affects all of us, not just that one community. The other part of talking about the Latino culture and the context is who we are. And one of my books that deals with language and culture, I asked, rose by any other name, smells sweet, but the reality is that names with a Latino is one of the first challenges. Are we Hispanic, Chicano, Latino, Latinx, hyphenated American, Cuban American, Puerto Rican American? How do you tell which one to use? And the reality is you got to let the person define it. Hispanic talks about those that broad heritage that comes from the Spanish world, the Spanish-speaking culture that unites us. Chicano are the Mexican Americans, a power statement that was used in California and primarily in some parts of the Southwest. Latino recognizes a Latin heritage, Latin America, and includes some other cultures that might not be included in Hispanic, such as the Brazilians who speak Portuguese. But Latino has an O in it, which makes it gender exclusive. So for a while they were using Latino/A, Latino A, to include gender. But then that doesn't always include the different types of identity, and that's how we get to Latinx. Is to recognize that sometimes it is not inclusive when we speak of Latino or Latina. So try and make it more inclusive. Yet people will claim their own identity by choosing the name. And when we name others, in a sense, we're doing an act of violence, because there's power in a name, and a name controls the other by you defining them rather than allowing them self-definition. So whenever in doubt, use a more inclusive term, but also allow the people who you're dealing with to define themselves. Do you see yourself as a Latino or Latina, Hispanic, Puerto Rican American or Dominican American, or just, from your country of origin? The other thing about it is that the Latino and Hispanic was a way of the United States government to define who we were based on our heritage, because we didn't fit into any of the classes and race structures. We weren't necessarily Black, some of us were, but not all. But we weren't also considered white. And it was imposed upon us, but in some ways we have taken it up. And it's really an ethnicity that is inclusive of multiple races. I have cousins who are Chinese, Cubans. I have other relatives who are, my best friend is Black Dominican. They're all Latinos. So Latino is not just white or brown, it's also Black and Asian in some instances, and indigenous. So when we say Latino, we're not speaking necessarily of one race. In many cases, we're talking of multiple races that encompass this ethnicity. And in some ways, we embody multiple races. But I did my DNA profile, and although I'm mostly European, I also have indigenous Cuban, I have African, and even Scottish Irish. Go figure. So Latinos are very diverse people. You cannot understand this just by seeing us in a monolithic way. Politically, we're in different various spectrums, from conservative to liberal, depending on where you live, and certain ideals and religion. We have anywhere from evangelical to Catholic. So when you think of Latinos, you cannot think of just one thing. I remember when I was teaching at the University of Puget Sound, and I got my first job, my first tenure track job at a Research One institution, Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. And the chair of the department there at the University of Puget Sound, they said, "Oh, you're going to Texas, you're going to feel so at home there with all the burritos and tacos." And I'm like, I'm Cuban. I never had a burrito or a taco until I was like 12 or 14. I ate, Cuban sandwiches, black beans and rice and pork. We're not the same. We're very diverse. And that in some ways is our strength, that we embody multiple cultures and races and foods. It's also our weaknesses, because it's hard to define us. It's hard to put us in the bottle. And often that also makes it hard for us to unite and have a common purpose. And that is part of the challenge of being Latino. It doesn't really fit the traditional paradigms. And when we start talking about race discourse, the United States has had a bipolar concept of race. We think of race as black-white in that divide because of the history of slavery, and it has been one of the most defining tragedies in America, that what we've seen happen. But there were many Latinos who were also discriminated against. There was a book I was hearing about, and I can't remember the name, but it was talking about the campaign the Texas Rangers waged on Mexican and indigenous people in the Southwest, how many were killed. There was a point that the numbers of lynchings of Latino had surpassed any other racial group in the United States during that era. But it's a history that is hidden. Nobody really knows about that part. They don't know about the migrants. I work as a mission pastor with migrant workers and the conditions they live. It's abject poverty, third floors, working basically for almost nothing with no benefits in the fields with backbreaking labor. And in many ways, because of their fear of authority and their, in some cases, undocumented status, they have very little rights. And it's almost a form of indentured servitude in some of those cases. But people don't see that. The dialogue doesn't include us often. And I have friends growing up in the Southwest that used to tell me that in the 60s, during segregation, and when they were traveling from one place to another, they get to a restaurant, and if they had to use the restroom, they weren't allowed in the black restroom because they weren't black, but they weren't allowed in the white restroom because they weren't white, and there was no other restroom. So they had to hold it the whole trip because they didn't fit the paradigm in the United States. So in many ways, we live in the hyphen, we live in the middle. And sometimes we are part of multiple races, and some part we are excluded from all of them. And that is part of the Latino reality that sometimes it's hard to get at the table in the discourse. And I really appreciate some of the scholars who now don't just speak of one oppressed group of people, but they talk about Black and Brown and the shared oppression, because often the way that segregation and racism work is by dividing, by saying, well, this people are not the same as this people. Or if we give rights to this people, you won't get it. Well, like a Latino Chicano comedian once said, you know, they're always telling us, oh, you know, you want a slice of the pie, and there's just enough pie to divide. And this comedian says, I don't want a slice of pie, I want the recipe. And I think that's something that we need, is to stop thinking that it's a zero-sum game, that if one person gets more rights or finds equality, the other loses. It has to be, you know, rising tide lifts all ships. We got to stand united and stop the divisive discourse, because it not only affects minoritized community, it also affects poor people. And some of the most impoverished people are white in the United States. But racial discourse has fragmented us and fostered those divisions to pit us against each other instead of working together to find the common challenges of oppression and economic and otherwise that systemically divided us a country. And there's a philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, who said that history is like a searchlight. It shines upon one and renders everything else into obscurity. And I think it's important to recognize that, because history is told by those who win, and it's also told from particular perspectives, and it hides a lot of things. It glosses over many things. And Latinos are often a part of that hidden history, as many others. And Latino Heritage Month tries to highlight that contribution that Latinos made to America that often goes unrecognized. One of the things I put there, because you know, your medical professions, most of you probably know Walter Reed and the fight against yellow fever, right? But most people don't hear about Carlos Finley. Carlos Finley was a Cuban doctor that preceded Reed, and a lot of Walter Reed's research goes back to and looks at Carlos Finley's research seeing mosquitoes as a vector for yellow fever. But everybody recognizes Walter Reed as the one who, did the work on yellow fever, and Carlos Finley's contributions are ignored. There's other contributions that have happened throughout history. If we just look, for instance, at the actors and people in the media, a lot of people know Raquel Welch is Latina. Martin Sheen is Latino. If you think about it, his son, Emilio Estevez, how did that happen? Well, it's because he took the family name instead of a screen name. Other actors or singers, Linda Ronstadt, Latina. A lot of people don't get that. And so to succeed, they had to take on screen names that didn't sound Latino, and they could make it that way. So even things like, I was just telling some people last night, I'm sure many of you grew up with sloppy joes, right? Very traditional American food. It's a Cuban food, actually. Sloppy joes were originated from Cuban picadillo, a ground beef stew that was at the Sloppy Joe's bar in Havana, was served to sailors on bread. But that, again, another part of the hidden contributions. And there's many, many more about of those. The Latinos have been astronauts and researchers, have been very involved in many different cutting edge work, but often they're not recognized, and particularly historically, that contribution doesn't get recognized. And as I share, we're hidden from race discourse. A lot of times it's hard to find a seat at the table. And during the Black Lives Movement, which recently, I appreciated the leaders that shared that it was, not just a Black issue, brown lives also were being affected, because there were just, during that period, there was many killings of brown people and Mexicans and Latinos, but often they weren't brought into the discussion. And the encounters with authority are there. And during the whole situation about George Floyd's murder at the hands of the police, I kept remembering a time when I was working doing children's camp, summer camps in Houston. I was driving a church bus picking up people. I was about just turned 18 at the time, so I was young, Latino, driving this van. It stalled on me, getting close to picking up these kids, and all of a sudden, police car pulls behind me. Lights turn on. I say, "Oh, they're here to help me." No. I see your license or registration. Oh, this is expired. My license doesn't expire. This is from out of state. I'm going to have to take you in. All kind, threatening behavior and all that. Luckily, this couple that knew me that lived in the neighborhood came out, a white couple, and said, "Oh, what's going on?" And they vouched for me and said, "Well, I don't feel like taking, going and doing all the paperwork, so I'll just let you go." And at no time was there any legitimacy in that stop. And then other times during my time there, I got stopped by police and asked for ID and questioned just by walking in the neighborhood. What I couldn't help remember thinking was that George Floyd grew up in that, maybe a mile from where I got stopped, in that neighborhood in Houston. And he probably was about the age of the kids I was picking up and taking to those camps. And I think if I was having that experience at that time, I wonder what experience he had. And I wonder if he was even one of those kids that attended those camps that I worked with. And it broke my heart, but it also recognized some of the challenges that are faced by both Black and brown people in the United States. And how unfortunate it is that some of us, just by the way we look, are considered a threat, and others are not. And I told a lot of officers from police academy and others that it's not because I'm afraid that the police is a threat to me, but that they will perceive me as a threat to them when they stop me, because we've racialized people so much. And unfortunately, some of that aspect doesn't always get put in there. At the same time, in the United States, the Hispanic population has become the largest minority population. In 2019, it had grown to 18.5, and the new census reveals that we're close to 20% of the population of the United States. Interestingly enough, Worcester is now a majority city. There is not a single majority group. Latino population has grown dramatically, African population, African American, as well as other populations in Worcester, to the point that now there is no single majority in Worcester. Yet at the same time, if we think about the Latinx community in Massachusetts, most people are surprised when they hear that. I'm not as surprised, but that there was a study in 2018 that was made by 24/7 Wall Street, and it listed Massachusetts as the worst state for Latinx in several measures, a measure of poverty, income, educational attainment, unemployment, and incarceration. I mean, can you imagine that? Massachusetts, we're a very progressive state, and it's considered the worst state for Latinx in the nation on all these measures, where we fall behind. If you look at the gap in educational attainment, that based on research that was done by the Board of Higher Education and their move to the equity agenda, the attainment of Latino males is 43% lower than that of white female as of 2018. And I suspect that it's gone down with the pandemic. And the challenge is that this is the fastest growing population in Massachusetts, and the thing that has kept us from losing population and demographic decline, the fact that Latinos population, the immigrant population that come into the state. But if we don't educate people and we can't put out a trained workforce, we're going to fall behind economically. We need to close those gaps, particularly the ones that's been affected, Latino males. The other thing is, so you look at the demographic progressions of the mix of populations, you'll see continual decline in the white population, that by 2032, 22% of the population of Massachusetts is predicted, the high school graduates are predicted to be Latinos, 11% African American, 10% other. Look at the comparison to 2002. That is a big jump. And that is one of the things that has kept the population somewhat steady throughout those years, and even led to some growth. But we're going to start facing challenges if we continue with the racial divide, and 1/3 of our high school graduates are minoritized individuals, and if they don't have the equal access and they don't have equity in higher education, we're not going to have the strength as a Commonwealth to sustain ourselves economically and in many other areas. We're going to have to be importing talents from outside. Now, those of you who are more involved in some of the healthcare probably realize that a pandemic impact was dramatic, and you've probably seen those figures. That although the Latino population might be lower, 44% of the cases were in the Latino population, even though it was 16% of the population. Same thing, Blacks, 13% of cases compared to 8%. And white population, 39% of the cases, but there were significantly higher numbers of the general population. That tells me that there is an issue on how the access to healthcare and economic status is affected Latinos in this pandemic, and actually contributed to more cases and death and has significant economic employment. If you look economically, the unemployment rate among Latinx was 14.2% in February 2020 to April 2020. And the widening income and wealth inequalities are continuing to exacerbate the divide. The Latino population is being left behind. Physically, there's been a very deep impact of structural inequalities. Not only is the challenge of violence, but also things like addiction and uneven access to healthcare. You have a lot of medical care deserts out there, just as you have food deserts, another thing, where people don't have access to quality healthcare, and they're often underdiagnosed or treated differently than other populations. And I've had that experience myself, going into a doctor and being looked at, oh, what's wrong with you? Oh, okay, it's probably this, move on, rather than given a thorough exam. Psychological impact of the pandemic has also been devastating. There's been emotional stress because most of those families are living close together and multi-generational. And then finding care for children that are out of school has forced some people to stay home and not be able to work, making worse the economic impact. And then there's been a lot of studies that has shown that many Latinos and Blacks have abandoned their hopes of attaining education. And again, I believe education transforms lives, and people are not getting educated. And for us, there's been a significant drop in the enrollment of Latino males due to the pandemic. We've seen that both in the Latino and Black community. Males in particular have lost a lot of presence and enrollment in higher education. And I suspect there's multiple reasons. Needing to work to support the family, and more traditional homes where the women stayed home to take care of the kids that were out of school, and the men had to take extra jobs to make up the loss of income, and the lack of access to training that's more manual, that attracted more males. But that's a significant challenge for many of us in higher education. We even saw it at Quinsig in terms of our pass rates. And you'll see that from 2019 to 2020, females had a drop, but that drop was even more substantial for Black and Latino men in terms of their attainment and pass rates. And the lower socioeconomic, those who are on Pels, were impacted more significantly than others. Based on the pandemic. One of the things that we have to overcome is the barriers to education. For many, it's a lack of financial resources, family responsibilities. When I was going to college and I was saying I was going to major in religion, my grandfather's barber said, "Oh, I thought you were going to get a career." It's a lot of pressure to get money that will contribute to your family. Latinos don't think in terms of the individual, and that's the case for many other cultures as well. But for us, our thought unit is family. We function in terms of family. We think in terms of family, not as of individual. And responsibilities to the family come first. There's also a lack of teacher support. They don't understand, and we don't have role models in school. We saw that here in Worcester, that low percentage of minority of teachers in the K-12 compared to the number of kids, 70% diverse. There's a significant push on peer pressure, where you have peer pressure to find belonging in other ways than through education, and sometimes you're ridiculed for being smart. There are cultural barriers. You've got to work and take care of your family, education. It's that they don't see that as investment. And systemic racism and discrimination. When we talk about kids in high school and even in first, second grade as at risk, that burns me up. No kids at risk. They're all full of potential. The risk that they face is us, the barriers that we create when we see them as less, when we see them as less able than others, when we look at them with suspicion just because of the way they look or the language that they speak or the way they act. Often the cultural divide, I'm Latino, I'm dying here because I can't move around and move my hands, because that's what we do when we speak. And if you're in a school and you're a kid, you're going to be moving your hands, and you're going to talk loudly, and you're going to interrupt. That's just part of the culture. And then you're seen as a troublemaker immediately, just by being who you are. And then that stays with you and makes you think that you're inferior throughout. Those barriers are there. And it is part of that systemic race and discrimination. The rate of suspension for Latinos in Worcester Public School was disproportionately high. It's gotten a little better, but it's still too high. And when you have first, to third grade kids being suspended from school for behavior, come on, they're kids. They're gonna act out. That's not a danger. It's nothing reason to pull them out of schools. It's just people that don't want to be troubled by them. And that bothers me. High stakes tests. All the high stakes tests do is show us basically who is good at taking tests. And it's been proven that discrimination against Black and Latino kids throughout, anywhere from the high school MCAS all the way into the tests for admissions to college, SATs or JEE. They're all barriers because a variety of reasons. The access to funds to take the test over and over again, to have tutoring, the way that the tests are constructed, the language that is used, all these things become barriers. The pressure that is done, especially if you're not a native speaker. I had a student said, "Oh, I got stuck on a question. I couldn't finish the test." It says, "Then you move on." They don't. That's not taught. And at Quinsig, at one point, the placement test, when I came in, I've showed the faculty data. 65% of those being put in developmental ed were Latinx and Black kids. And a lot of it is because the placement tests were high stakes tests. Now that we've moved more into multiple measure, that has gone significantly down. But the achievement rate hasn't declined. Tests don't measure anything. And then labeling. Latinos have been called lazy, part of the Black legends that labeled us as during the wars between America or England and Spain, and later on as Manifest Destiny pushed the empire building of the United States into the Southwest. They're lazy, they're shifty. They don't look us in the eyes, so you can be trusted. But as a Latino, when you're a kid, we're told, don't look me in the eye while I'm talking to you. It's a sign of respect that you're not looking them in the eye. Nevertheless, that's one of the challenges we face. And one of the barriers I put there is equality. Because equality, it's a barrier. When we talk about equality, equal access doesn't mean equity. If I go into a restaurant and I have $5 in my pocket and my friend has 20, and you have sandwiches for $10, who's going to eat better? You have equal access to that restaurant, but you don't go in with the same resources. And that in itself becomes a barrier. So talking about equality, making things equal, sometimes it's a barrier for those who haven't been treated equal throughout their lives and who have been given less resources or access to them. And then there's an internalized bias. All this stuff that goes on, we internalize it. and we believe it. So we start believing that we're inferior. We don't belong, that we don't belong as president of college. And I remember talking to one of my faculty colleagues when I started teaching, it was Latino, and says, can you believe that we're here? I feel like someday they're gonna get onto us or something, kick us out. There's this feeling of internalized racism that has affected us so much. The same way, there are significant barriers to healthcare, and racism and economic affects us. You have limited access to health resources, insurance, specialized treatments often are not available or too costly or not covered. Food and health deserts, you don't have access to quality food, so you don't have great diets, and that affects your health. And the one thing I want to highlight there is the economic unnatural selection. You may say, why is that? Years ago, I spoke at a conference on biomedical ethics that was hosted by the UT Medical School, Law School, and SMU, where I was teaching. And I spoke about the concept of economic unnatural selection, specialized treatments, biologics, even fertility treatments, and all this thing are costly and often not covered by insurance. So what happens there? Those who have money, who have power, have tended to have more access to those things. Minority communities have less resources, don't have access, and often they don't get treatment. They die younger. They can't have kids if they have fertility issues. They can't get, the right medical attention. I know UMass has done a wonderful work at trying to make it accessible to everyone, but that is a significant barrier. And I call it unnatural selection because it's not selection of the fittest, it's selection of the richest. And that's a problem that we need to face ethically as a country, but also in areas of education and medicine and other things. Other issues of healthcare is the lack of trust. A lot of people have been experimented on, and Puerto Rico and other cultures. So we kind of look at the medical establishment with some suspicions. We don't want to be used as guinea pigs. Language barriers. When I went to doctors as a kid, it was hard for me to explain body parts because they're called something different in Spanish. And since I don't refer to them in English, I couldn't think of the English term. It hurts there, but I couldn't explain the same way I could in Spanish. And often, it leads to misunderstanding. Lack of cultural competency, often by healthcare professionals that don't treat you with the same seriousness or don't understand some cultural issues that affect you. And housing, transportation, and unemployment are constant barriers to most of us. So what lessons have we learned? And I'm getting ready to close it off. I wanted to leave some time for questions, but I'm looking at the time and we're running short on that. I think one of the lessons that we can take away from the pandemic and from looking at some of the Latino Heritage Month issues and the pieces that it covers, that education is critical for everything. Education helps us become better workers, better citizens, helps us take better care of ourselves. And there have been a lot of studies that said the higher levels of education not give you more access to healthcare, but also make you more willing to advocate for yourself and to recognize things. So education affects multiple facets of your life. The other thing is that we can't do things with a one-size-fits-all approach. We got to target people where they're at. I understand that, particularly for Latinos, we're very different. So what might work with the Puerto Rican community might not work with the Cuban or the Dominican or the Salvadoran or Central American or South American, because there are different cultures, different relationships to doctors and to others, understandings. We also need to understand that we're all in this together. if anything, the pandemic has shows us that you can't really, viruses don't discriminate. Economic conditions and health conditions that have led to that might, and might make us more susceptible to them. But when you get sick, one sick person, everybody around them is going to get sick. And we can isolate ourselves from others in our community to the extent that anything's happened. So just in the same way that we're all in this together, we're all in this together in things of racism, overcoming bias. And as if you ever want to read a good book, it's Some of Us. There was a recent reading of that. It's just, she puts it out there very well. It's economically, it affects us all. You can't, whether you're white, black, brown, racism and discrimination has an effect on us, on our economy, on our country as a whole. We also recognize that there's a need for healing. Our country is fractured and hurting, and we need to heal. We need to talk to us. We also discovered through this that there's a strong sense of resiliency among us. We've been able to overcome a lot of things, and we'll continue to rebound. And the pandemic has brought to the forefront a lot of the fractures and challenges in our community, things that we wanted to keep hidden, all of a sudden become more clear. And racism and systemic oppression is one of them. But we also learned that we need to be more flexible and to adapt more and not be as rigid. And a lot of times it's the rigidity of identity and culture and racial stereotypes that don't allow us to enter into dialogue and see our common humanity and see our common fragility and look at each other with compassion. So when we look to the future, and the theme was Esperanza, hope, I was reminded of Emily Dickinson's poem. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And when I look at someone who's been working towards advocacy for seeing education as a human right and something, and just as I see healthcare and other pieces, housing and so forth, seeing what we've gone through and seeing the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, and the Latinos at the border, the kids in cages, the horrible humanitarian crises, I feel sometimes broken, like, what's there to hope? But I still have hope, and I have hope for couple of reasons. We've increased awareness of the gaps in our society. We become more aware and willing to work on it. I see renewed activism and advocacy in our communities. I see people energized. And I remember in a conference I went to some time ago, I was sitting with some of the civil rights leaders of the 60s, a couple of them, and even with some Tuskegee Airmen. And one of the things they said, Luis, the problem with this generation is they think civil rights are already done and we're there, and we're not. We need to keep working. And I think people realize that. The complacency of thinking that we're a post-racial America, that myth is gone. And we realize that there's still work to be done. And that gives me hope, because it's renewed advocacy and has allowed us to have these conversations and others like this that open up those hidden festering wounds, and it's the first step in bringing healing. And Worcester being a majority community, that's something to celebrate. Unfortunately, there's some in our community that are going to fear it. Oh, we're losing control, we're losing identity, we're no longer who we are. Well, come on, this makes us stronger. It's the multiple threads that weave themselves into a community that makes us strong as a community and that binds us together. And I think the growing recognition and support that we're seeing is important. Our youth also give me hope and let me think that the future is bright, because they get it. They see the environmental crisis. They see the economic issues. They see racism, and they're speaking up. And they're not just looking at it from one perspective or another, they're looking at it together. So you got white and brown and Black kids working together, Asian Americans and Indigenous Americans, for uniting against those things that tear us apart. And that gives me hope. And I think that we have greater solidarity. And that also gives me hope. The fact that we're having this discussion, that we're talking about it, and not just talking, but taking steps in that direction. So to wrap it up, I'll say, what can we do to ensure a better future? And I would add an O after Latin, but I don't want to be sexist and just be male and gender exclusive. So I kind of threw it in after a name. But it's a little acronym that came as I was thinking what to do. The first thing that we do to change things, to be more aware of the contributions to the multiple cultures that make up America, the richness that's there, is to educate yourself. Often the burden of talking about racism, culture is put on those of us who are the minorities. Oh, you're the ones who have to change. No, it's those who are in power, those who represent the majority, need to learn. They can't just ask us about it. You need to take it upon yourself to learn. And you're taking the first step by being part of this, to learn. The second thing is to act. It's not enough to know about this. We got to take action. Engage in dialogue with others. And not just with others that are diverse, but others like you to help expand their knowledge. And when you see somebody doing something, racism, you see something, say something. Don't stay quiet. Speak up. Because if you don't do it, nobody will. Somebody has to take a stand. And teach, educate others. You learn and you act, but you teach others, the next generation, kids, those who are going to emulate you, your co-workers. Help them come to the knowledge that we all contribute to society, that we're all Americans, hyphenated Americans. But that's what makes us strong as a country. That's what makes us strong as a community. And we need to be more inclusive and find out those barriers that separate us or that keep others from succeeding and move it forward. Not being afraid that there's just so much pies and if everybody gets a slice, we'll be left without it. We got to get after that recipe. We got to make pie instead of being concerned about just so many slices, because if not, somebody's going to be eating all the pies and it's not going to be us. We got to work together, be more inclusive, and remove the barriers that prevent some from achieving success. And you got to name it. So many people are so afraid to call it out and say, oh, there's, this is not racism. Oh, don't call me a racist. We all have internalized racism and biases that we need to contend with. First step is to admit it, and to when we see it, name it. Paul Tillich, a theologian that I studied, said that the first step in overcoming evil is by naming it, to recognize it as evil. And evil destroys for the sake, just for destruction's sake. And we got to recognize it, we got to name it, and then we got to change it. And that gives me hope. And finally, if I was going to add the O, is seek opportunities. Find ways that we can work together to a better future, a future that is equitable and that unites us and celebrates the diversity that makes us strong and allows all voices to be heard and recognizes everyone's contribution, because that makes us richer. It's only those that see those perspectives that we don't that can get us to see a bigger picture. If I look forward, and I used to do this with my student, if I'm looking forward and you're looking at me, I'm seeing things you can't see and you're seeing things I can't see. And by entering into that greater dialogue that brings together multiple perspectives, it helps us become better. We need to stop talking about us against them. And what we need to do is find ways to expand the concept of we the people, the more people that fit under we, under us, and less as them, that we're going to become stronger and overcome the barriers of the future. And that gives me hope. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions, but if you want to ask some question, I have a little bit of time that I could share.
I think we can close out the program with remarks from Dean Flott, and then if people want to stay on, we can ask questions after that.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Duncan, and thank you so much, President Predraja, for that terrific talk and conversation. I would, I think I'm going to stay on for some of the question and answer myself, but I just want to applaud you, first of all, for sharing your personal experience. And I think it's so telling your family's tradition and the value they instilled in you of your education, and how you, one thing you have in common with us is being in the public sector education. We're the state's schools, trying to provide access very equitably for all the citizens of the state for what we do. And it's a journey. We're far from perfection on that. I would love to hear later in a Q&A if we can in some way learn from you, and you can hear from us about some of the initiatives we're undertaking at the medical school to try to enhance the diversity of our faculty, because we talk very much about how for our learners, the faculty are their role models. They're how they potentially could see themselves in their future. And this is something that our Vice Provost, Milagros Rizal, who's also a highly accomplished health equity researcher, has taken on as her primary initiative. So I will wrap up those so that those who had to leave at the hour can get off, and just give you our overwhelming thanks and gratitude for sharing this, your insights, but also your personal experiences. It is very, very powerful to do those things together.
Thank you. So I have time for some questions somebody wants to ask, or put it in the chat or something.
If it's possible, can I follow with my comment and ask a question about recruiting diverse faculty in your position in leading the faculty at Quinsigamond Community College, right in our neighborhood here?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a challenge because we need to build a pipeline. I spoke a little bit about the barriers that exist. And if we can't get those kids in the high schools to dream about becoming teachers and doctors and community leaders, we're always going to be fighting for just a few that are out there. So we got to work together to create those pipelines and inspire the kids and the young men and women, and remove the barriers that exist, so that they can enter into education. The other thing is we need to look at the way that we do recruitment. Often the way that we advertise, the parameters we set are exclusive in nature. As a Latino, for instance, there's a lot of work that I do with community or things that happen that might not count as academic, and people might not look at it as something that will get you a job in higher education. And I think we need to open up to that. Latinos are often having to do extra work. We all have to be in the committees. We got to be represented. And so we're doing that. And so we don't have as much time to publish, to go to presentations. And we got to recognize that service is also part of what makes a good teacher, and educate the search committees about biases. So part of it is the way that we frame the recruitment, and part of it is the way we do that. And I just hired a new executive director of HR to work on that. And we're looking now for a talent manager to help us with recruitment. We did an equity assessment of the institution, and we're now looking at it. And part of the issues that came up is the lack of diversity in faculty. And we're going to work on a strategic plan to hire that. But you have to go out of your way to intentionally look. Just putting a statement at the end of this of a job advertising, say, "Oh, we invite a diverse, inclusive," that's just talk. You got to show that you're intentionally working to diversify and recruiting, and then go to those professional associations that bring that. I've been doing a lot of that on my staff at the administrative level, which I can, but it's harder when you're doing faculty because the search committees and the certain credentials that are required. But I think we can do it. We just got to work at it, not just give lip service to it. I see Jaime Rivera and Josh Singer after that.
Yes. I want to, first of all, thank you for a very nice presentation. I have a comment and a question. My comment is that it caught my attention what you mentioned against the discrimination of Latinos. And I just want to point out that there were restaurants, I think up to the 50s, that have signs outside that says no Latinos, no Mexicans or dogs allowed on these restaurants. So that's something that was happening also to Mexicans. And my question is, how do we retain minority faculties?
That's an excellent question, and it's one that I struggle. I think part of it is that if you don't have colleagues to talk to that share your perspective, it's very difficult to find that sense of belonging in an institution. Part of it is creating intentional community. And that you bring in a new faculty, sometimes you throw into the workload and they're isolated. And you have to continually connect with them. I was in an institution, I worked hard to get this African-American psychology professor in there. She was excellent, brought her in, even up the salary together. And within a year, she was gone. And I realized that I hadn't been intentional in making sure she felt like she belonged in that department. And she felt excluded, that her contributions weren't being valued. And most of us who have been like Latinos and all that have experienced that our accomplishments get dismissed. We're told, oh, that, this other people are excellent, but when you do the same thing, it's glossed over or looked at with suspicion. I had a faculty member that said something at a faculty meeting and everybody just kind of ignored it. And then a white colleague said, same thing. And they immediately, oh, that's excellent, brilliant. And this faculty member looked and says, he said the same thing I just did. Oh, no, it was different. Says, the only thing he did, he went like this with his hands. And it's that fact, we take some people more seriously than others. So we have to listen and be open to that and recognize our own internalized bias. I think it was Ta-Nehisi Coates once said, and I don't know the exact quote, but that we look at some more with sympathy and others with suspicion, something to effect. And that's true. That's where racism really manifests itself. So we got to start looking at everyone with the potential and then bringing those faculty members that are new and bring them into community. Those who are minorities need to go out of their way to bring them into the fold. But us as administrators, we got to check in on them. And sometimes, because there are such few groups, and right now I'm the head of HECMA, the Higher Education Consortium, Central Massachusetts. One of the things I've talked to some of the other presidents, we need to create maybe faculty groups across the campuses. So you might have some faculty at medical school, and there might be faculty at Quincy, there may be faculty at Worcester State, and Clark, and other places that are Latinos, and maybe different disciplines. Maybe we need to have some get-togethers of those groups and create a community of people so that they feel a sense of belonging. And Josh Singer, I saw your hand earlier.
Yes, so I would like to ask you about the term Latinx. In languages other than English, and I'm specifically speaking about German because I haven't had any Spanish, nouns are given a female, are considered either female or male for no rhyme or reason that I know of. And I often wondered if that was the same case with Latino versus Latina. So I guess bottom line for me is, how do the Latinx, Latino populations, how do they want to be considered?
I think the
I
first,
don't know if it came from the Hispanic community or not.
yeah, I think the first thing is you got to check, because not everybody feels the same. I was working on as part of the leadership team of a coalition here at Leon, the Latino Empowerment and Organizing Network that we formed. And originally I was using Latinx, but some of the people object to that and said, no, we're Latino, that's just not right. So we have to go with Latino. But what happens is that, just, you're right, in some languages, and Spanish is one, that gender is assigned. You know, the sofa is female, and the table, but then, you know, the chair or some other thing might be male. There's no rhyme or reason. But in Spanish, the male tends to be inclusive of the female in the language, linguistically. But as we become more aware of gender inequalities, then to assume that the male inclusive female is not always the right way. So then now some people start saying Latino and Latina, or Latina, Latino A or Latina O, or they use the pound sign, the A with a circle, as a way of describing more inclusive, gender inclusive. And then what happened is academics like us, who always overthink things, start thinking, well, that doesn't, that's a very bipolar, you know, it kind of doesn't include people who don't fit in the binary notion of sexuality, and sexuality is a spectrum, and what about transgender and others there, non-binary people? Well, let's go with the X, you know. But then there are people now that are saying, well, the X is trying to X us out, you know. So the debate still goes on. It's not as easy as, you know, Black tends to be more gender neutral, and you can use it. Latino, our language makes it difficult on us. But what I would say is just ask the individual, because the name, having ownership of your name is a way of exerting, of showing your power, your empowerment, you know, your identity, and that, I think, becomes an important piece of it.
I agree with you, Luis, as the person, because for me personally, Latinx, I don't like that terminology, because to me it means Latin whatever, Latin obscure, Latin who. That's how it sounds to me. So it's different for every person.
Absolutely. Well, I don't see any question. I'm going to put my email on chat, and if you think of something, or if you want to have further dialogue about any topic, or invite me for other things, I'm open to it. And let me put that in. Okay, it's lpedraja@qcc.mass.edu. So I always welcome dialogue and discussion, and maybe we need to work to create some groups that will allow different minority faculty to get together and start discussing. But that doesn't mean we should just limit to minority. Other people who are interested in supporting that and be allies or colleagues or learn, you should join as well.
Yeah, we currently just started a Faculty of Color network. And so I think it would be great if we could think about ways to include other institutions in that community.
Yeah, maybe as at least every quarter or semester.
Yeah,
you know,
that'd be a great idea.
There are, you know, a meet and greet discussion topic.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. This was very informative. And I think it really, it just resonates some of the other messages that we've been talking about on campus lately, and really focusing on structural racism and the impact, and how we really do need to name it before we can really make substantial change. So thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
So much, Luis. It's great always good to see you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good day.
Thank you.